Democracy is important because it's the voice of the people, and increasingly I think we live in a political system where people's voices aren't really being heard.
The Tory government denying Scotland of democracy is just shocking for me, and them just trying to deny everything that Scotland wants so abruptly it's just appalling.
Democracy is everything to me and to the people of Scotland, and now democracy feels threatened.
As far as I'm concerned, was the removal of the democratic right of the Scottish people.
Again, it's a democracy thing.
They deserve a future that's truly democratic.
The latest polling shows majority support for independence, with yes at 52%. As Tories and Labour continue to deny Scotland's democracy, yes is up 5 points. Another sign why Westminster's denial of democracy might have seriously backfired. So, as Westminster denies Scottish democracy, people are moving to independence.
But today, our independence movement also becomes Scotland's democracy movement. Now, independence is not an abstract notion. Independence is about the prosperity of our nation. It is about the equality of our nation. It is about the internationalism of our nation. It is about building a better, fairer, more equal Scotland for this and generations to come.
It is absolutely the case, if the UK was a voluntary partnership, that this would not be needed. It does remain open to the UK government, however belatedly, to accept democracy and reach agreement. I make clear again today, therefore, that I stand ready at any time to reach agreement with the Prime Minister on an adjustment to the devolution settlement that enables a lawful democratic referendum to take place, a process that respects the right of people in Scotland to choose our future, in line with the clear mandate of the Scottish Parliament, lets politicians make the case for and against independence, and crucially allows the Scottish people to decide. The more contempt the Westminster establishment shows for Scottish democracy, the more certain it is that Scotland will vote yes when the choice does come to be made. And in that scenario, unless we give up on democracy, and again, for the avoidance of any doubt, I, for one, am simply not prepared to do that, we must and we will find another democratic, lawful and constitutional means by which the Scottish people can express their will. No party can dictate the basis on which people cast their votes, but a party can be, indeed should be, crystal clear about the purpose for which it is seeking popular support. In this case, for the SNP, that will be to establish, just as in a referendum, majority support in Scotland for independence, so that we can then achieve independence. In the meantime, the SNP will launch and mobilise a major campaign in defence of Scottish democracy. For we should be in no doubt, as of today, democracy is what is at stake. This is no longer just about whether or not Scotland becomes independent, vital though that decision is. It is now more fundamental. It is now about whether or not we even have the basic democratic right to choose our own future. Indeed, from today, the independence movement is as much about democracy as it is about independence.
Well, so the few clips that I just played there, you might have picked up on the sort of repetitive statement that was being made, irrespective of who was doing the talking, and that is to the point where they're making the word somewhat redundant at this point, the term democracy. The SNP are no strangers to repeating the same trope over and over and over again. For a good while, it was the hard and soft Brexit routine. Then it quickly changed to the Scotland's voice has been ignored routine. And for some time now, it's been democracy denial, and the accusation is thrown at anybody that opposes their BS. And just democracy in general. There's a heavy emphasis on democracy. They try to place themselves above some on top moral high ground, a moral high horse, as if they are the saviours of democracy, they're the protectors of democracy, they're standing up for the people. And of course, they get away with this narrative because they've been able for some time to revise history unchallenged. Their opponents, the people that are allegedly the unionists in this debate, if you want to call it that, they never seem to call them out on their blatant BS or their hypocrisy, such as what you can see on the screen here. Kind of rich for a party to talk about democracy and protecting democracy and standing up for democracy while gallivanting around in 2019 in a Stop Brexit bus. Nicola Dunlop's herself in London that same year in 2019 stood on a stage advocating for a second EU referendum. And for all the years leading up to that point, we were bombarded with never-ending attempts to do whatever they could to ensure that that referendum result could not be acted upon. And just on a side note as well, before I go any further, it's quite remarkable how if you call out the SNP or anybody challenges the SNP on any of their failures, that things that have gone wrong under their watch, they constantly blame the pandemic, right? But yet, they blame Brexit on everything. And I've always found that somewhat perplexing, because Brexit allegedly happened, and a few months later, we were slap bang in the middle of a so-called pandemic. But yet, that can't be blamed for all the shortcomings of our country. No, that has to be Brexit. But yet, their failures can be blamed on the pandemic. It's funny how that works. But I just want to touch upon this. This came out a few days ago, 30th of January. Angus Robertson, one of the most insufferable, reprehensible wankers in that parliament. I don't like him, I think he's a dickhead. But he's the latest to come out and effectively vindicate me, and I take no pleasure in this vindication. But I have been saying this for some time, that this was the direction of travel the SNP would undertake in the event of a hypothetical referendum coming to pass. And of course, this isn't the first time that the SNP have said this. In 2021, Thin Lips herself effectively said the same thing. There would be no EU referendum in the event of winning a hypothetical Indy Ref 2. So in essence, it was a double referendum. A vote for independence was an instantaneous or simultaneous vote for rejoining the European Union at a later date. A few years later, after a hiatus, a silence for some time, SNP Minister Angus Robertson claims independent Scotland rejoined the European Union without a referendum. But yet, all the clips that I just played there, and that wasn't me meticulously picking clips. No, this is just the running theme at this point. Democracy. Heavy emphasis on democracy. And you're a democracy denier if you disagree with that narrative. Is that not democracy denial? Is this not democracy denial? To remove the ability for people, in the event of winning a hypothetical Indy Ref to decide at a later date whether or not they wish to rejoin the European Union. Now, they're not a winner, of course, because all of the country's faults, all of the failures of the country, all the problems that the country faces, that's the fault of Brexit. Nothing to do with the so-called pandemic and all the BS that came along with it. No, nothing to do with that at all. No. It's all Brexit's fault. And over the years, they've blurred the lines, deliberately, of course, to insinuate independence and European Union membership are one in the same. They've been doing this for years. So much so, of course, that they've even revised history to such a point that if they were sincere and their narrative was indeed correct and truthful, they would have a legitimate point. But therein lies the point. It's predicated on falsehoods and total manipulation, as well as revisionist history, which I'll come on to. To be clear, there was no inevitability of any of this happening, but I think the commitment of people to take that next step, which we should never forget, was made possible because of previous generations who built up the SNP and the idea of Scottish independence over decades without any prospect of success that gave us the foundations to hold on. And this is something I've said for some time, for anybody that's new to the channel, because I do realise that I've been gaining quite a lot of subs as of late, last few months. I've got no issue, albeit I vehemently disagree with your standpoint. I've got no issue with people making the case to rejoin the European Union. Just don't fucking call it independence. Don't pretend that they're the same thing. And here we are now with opinion polls regularly showing a majority of those who have an opinion on the subject supporting Scottish independence. But this is one of the many tropes that they love to throw out when it suits. When an opinion poll doesn't go in their favour, they're quite quick to dismiss it and say, well, polls fluctuate, right? But let's just play along with their little narrative for a second and suggest that these polls that they speak of are indicating a consistent push in the direction of support for independence. They're misleading polls because there's not 3 questions. There's 2 questions. Do you favour independence or do you not? That means that people that wish to leave the UK with the intention of rejoining the European Union are forced to vote the same way as those who do not wish to do that but wish to leave the UK. 2 separate groups of people are forced to vote the same way in their fucking polls. That does not indicate a strength in support or a seismic shift in the direction of support for independence. That just showcases that they're forced to vote the same way in your poll. However, and if one looks at the next generation of voters, an overwhelming level of support for independence amongst the younger people in Scotland, running between 60 and 70%. Yes, that's a damning indictment of society in many respects, because obviously the generations that are just about a voting age, if they're not already, they've just come out of the schooling system, that progressive conveyor belt. Anyway, we're getting to the point of this. Scotland was granted a referendum using a Section 30 order following the 2011 Scottish Parliament election, even though the poll suggested at the time a big difference from victory in terms of public opinion. Yet now, when there's a majority elected to the Parliament again, with a mandate for independence, right? This is what they say. And it's remarkable, just on a side note quickly, how you could make the argument, because this is what they do when it suits them, they will home in on the fact that they've got a mandate for independence. That would effectively suggest that they're more or less a one-trick pony, right? But then when they start to push for things such as the gender controversy that's going on at present, they claim that people voted them in for that. Oh, it was in our mandate. So how do you know then that people voted for you with independence in mind? They could have been voting for you for a myriad of different reasons, considering the fact you've got a manifesto full of nonsense. Oh, no, when it suits, it's all about independence. This is what they do. Anyway, point being though, independence, but yet he's ruled out, and he's not the first to do so, he's just the latest dickhead to do so. They've ruled out a referendum on rejoining the European Union at a later date, insisting that they're one and the same. Therefore, your mandate for independence is not a mandate to rejoin the European Union, but yet that's what you're doing anyway. # democracy denial. No, of course no, because they care. They're so progressive. I think it's profoundly bad for all the nations of the UK, meaning Brexit. But even in the television studio, on the night of the referendum, it was obvious from the minute it was understood that Scotland was going to vote Remain, but the rest of the UK was going to vote Leave, that this totally changed the nature of Scotland's constitutional position. I remember looking over towards the other panellists with wide eyes when that became clear, because the powerful reality of what that meant was that we'd been lied to. That from Ruth Davidson downwards in Scottish politics, from the unionist side of the argument, we were told to vote no to Scottish independence to guarantee Scotland's membership of the European Union. We knew then, and we know now, that a great many people voted no because of that. There's the revisionist history, on full display again. Now, they've been doing this for some time, and they just seem to be a bit more brazen as of late, such as the premise of this fucking article, for example. Because for a time, they would never have had the temerity to come outright and say that your independence vote would have been hijacked and redirected towards support for European Union membership. But more importantly, more fundamentally, at the 2014 referendum, which I voted to leave in, I don't ever recall hearing that excuse being mentioned. It was only years later that that became something that was coined by all of them, and it's gone unchallenged. And as I said, if they were sincere and that was a truthful statement, you could see how they have a point. And this is where I get somewhat irritated by the entirety of this whole debacle, because there's a lot of young people in this country, for example, who might not necessarily have been politically literate or at an age where they gave a shit, but now they're somewhat invested, and all they're hearing is this revisionist bullshit from the SNP, unchallenged, of course, which would suggest then that what they're saying is somewhat truthful, and they then in turn begin to sympathise or support the SNP's endeavours, when the reality of the matter is it's based on total shite. Absolute shite. They will have you believe that the SNP will have you believe, that the only reason, or the main fundamental reason, that Scotland voted to remain in 2014 was because of our promise to stay in the EU, suggesting that that's what this was all about in 2014. It was about the European Union. That was centre stage. When the reality of the matter was, if that was true, it calls into question each and every single one of these SNP politicians and independent supporting politicians and activists, etc., who claimed that they were pro-EU while simultaneously being pro-independence, because a vote to leave the UK in 2014 would have meant a vote to leave the EU. How does that one work? So effectively, the likes of Salmond and Sturgeon and Robertson, etc., they were all effectively advocating to leave the European Union, while they all ran about advocating for us to leave the UK. But on top of that, I will come to some of their shit in just a second, but just to scroll down a wee bit further, it says, I'm talking about the context of a Scotland where 62% of people voted to remain in the European Union. And I'm simply making the point that Brexit result, with Scotland voting to remain and England voting to leave, and that those differences in multinational state would then be so disregarded by the Westminster political leadership in the first instance, by the Conservatives, but now by Labour, who have adopted the same hard Brexit approach, hard Brexit, soft Brexit. This was a trope that they coined at the time. I know I'm preaching to the choir to some degree. It was leave or remain. There was none of this hard, soft shit, right? Point is, though, there's it again, the 62% nonsense, right? And I'll come to it, but it says the same disregard for the fact that people in Scotland voted to remain, that just profoundly changed the nature of the settlement, if you want to call it that, made after the 2014 independence referendum. So the 62% of people voted to remain in the European Union, a phrase that they repeatedly churn out. It's fucking borderline redundant and boring at this point, but yet it goes unchallenged and it appears sincere in nature when it's predicated on nonsense.
Frequently ask me two questions about the EU referendum. The first is, how can you support independence and back Scotland's membership of the EU? Well, the answer to that is simple. I believe that independent countries must cooperate to tackle common challenges. Every member of the EU is an independent country working with others for the greater good. The second question is whether a Brexit vote will mean a second independence referendum. Well, here's what the SNP manifesto at the recent election said about that. The Scottish Parliament should have the right to hold another referendum if there is a significant and material change in the circumstances that prevailed in 2014, such as Scotland being taken out of the European Union against our will. Now, I'm clear that if Scotland does indeed face that prospect of being taken out of Europe against our will, then that option is on the table. But to be clear, that situation only arises if Scotland votes remain next week. If Scotland votes to leave, then that premise for independence doesn't arise. But if you're basing your decision on what it means for independence, let me be very, very clear. The only sensible and logical vote is one for Scotland to remain in Europe.
Now, we know that roughly a third of the SNP's voter base at the time voted to leave the European Union, right? But what never gets addressed is the fact that that leaves 2/3 who voted the other way. Question is, though, how many voted to remain because they wished to see a referendum? How many did so influenced by Nicola Dunlop's? And it's interesting how this never ever gets mentioned. She played a pivotal role in influencing the Scottish Remain vote. So when they talk to no end about the 62% voting to remain, it's not really as clear-cut as they will have you believe. That the narrative of Scotland voted to remain and we got dragged out against our will is somewhat disingenuous in nature on the basis of the fact that the 62% figure that they love to wield out as their justification for their never-ending EU bullshit is predicated, at least in parts, by her and the party steering independent supporters in the direction of voting to remain in the EU, telling them, of course, that if you vote to leave, then you won't get a referendum. Strange. One could argue that that's manipulating voters, no? I ask him whether, if Scotland voted yes to independence, would there be the need for a second referendum on rejoining the EU, remembering that almost 40% of Scots voted to leave, and it is estimated that at least a third of them were SNP supporters. Robertson is adamant that there would not, and a vote for independence will be a vote to rejoin the EU. And he's quoted as saying, "The referendum case will be for Scottish independence within the European Union as a member state." Democracy, eh? The arbiters of truth, standing up for democracy. The party that bragged to no end about being all for Scottish democracy. And yet, they're denying it right in front of your fucking face.